You smell it before you see it. Something animal, something wrong. The staircase descends into the earth beneath the palace. Your torch throws shadows that move before you do. The air grows wet, then cold, then something else, entirely. Thick with a smell you will spend the rest of your life trying to forget. You are Emperor Hui of Han. The year is 195 BC. Your mother has brought you here herself. She says there is something you must see. She lifts the torch. You ask what it is. She says, "This is Lady Qi. You will fall gravely ill that night. You will never govern again. Your mother will rule China for 15 more years. Her name was Empress Lü, and she was only the first. What you're about to hear is not entertainment. These are true stories. 10 women, 10 different centuries, 10 different kingdoms. And one thing they all share, a point at which absolute power met absolute pain, and the line between survival and brutality simply ceased to exist. Let us begin at the beginning, at the bottom of those stairs. One. Empress Lü, the woman who invented the human swine. China, 195 BC. Before there was an empire, there was a woman who made one possible. Her name was Lü Ji. She followed her husband, the rebel leader Liu Bang, through years of warfare, captivity, and humiliation. When enemy forces captured her, she endured imprisonment so that he could keep fighting. When he finally took the throne as Emperor Gouged of Han, she had given the best years of her life to that crown. He thanked her by filling the imperial harem with younger women. Among those women was Lady Qi, beautiful, talented, dangerous in the way that only a woman who has the emperor's ear can be dangerous. Lady Qi gave Liu Bang a son, clever, charming, beloved, and then did something that crossed a line from which there was no returning. She lobbied day and night for that son to be named Crown Prince, for Empress Lü's son to be displaced, for the woman who had built the empire to watch her future stripped away. Empress Lü fought back through ministers, through alliances, through the finest political strategist of the age. She won. Her son's position was secured. But some wounds do not close. They just go quiet. In 195 BC, Liu Bang died. Power passed to his son, and through his son to Empress Lü. She moved immediately. Lady Qi was arrested, and then, with the methodical patience of a craftsman finishing a piece of work that has been on the bench for years, Empress Lü gave her orders. Both arms, both legs, the eyes, the ears, a poison that stilled her tongue, not into silence, but into something worse than silence. Lady Qi could still produce sound, a low, formless sound, from somewhere behind what had once been her face. She was placed in a pit beneath the earth. Empress Lü called her the human swine. Then she brought her son to see. Emperor Hui stared into the pit. He did not recognize what he was looking at. He had to ask repeatedly who this was. He was told. He fell ill that night. He never truly governed again. His mother continued, removing rivals, executing generals, placing and removing emperors, with the casualness of someone rearranging furniture. She governed the Han dynasty for 15 years. Her economic policies helped a war-ruined empire recover. Her intelligence was unquestionable. The records note one final detail. Not long before her death, a black dog appeared from nowhere on a deserted road and bit Empress Lü on the arm. The wound never healed. People whispered it was Lady Qi's son, Liu Ruyi, whom she had also poisoned, returning in spirit form. After Empress Lü died, her clan was wiped from the earth by ministers loyal to the Han. Her name survived, not as a hero, as a warning about what patience and power, combined with a hatred that cannot be forgiven, can build in the dark. The next woman never asked for the throne, but she understood something the throne's rightful heir never did. That power goes not to the person who deserves it, but to the person who is willing to take it. 2. Ranavalona I, the queen who halved a nation. Madagascar, 1828 to 1861. Her story begins with a coincidence. Her father, a man of no particular importance, happened to overhear a plot against the king's life. He went to the palace and told what he knew. The king survived, and in gratitude, the king promised this man something remarkable. The hand of his daughter would be given to the crown prince. That daughter was Ramavo, the girl who would become Ranavalona I. She entered the royal palace not through ambition, but through luck, and for years she was nothing in it. Childless, powerless, one of many wives, easily overlooked. Radama I, her husband, showed her no particular favor. She was a faint name in a large court. Inside that stillness, something was forming, a plan so patient that the entire court, trained to watch for threats, simply missed it. In 1828, Radama I died suddenly. Under Marina succession law, the throne would pass to a nephew. Ranavalona would become a forgotten widow. She had perhaps days before that fate closed around her. She did not wait. She had been building alliances for years. Generals, nobles, men with grudges and ambitions of their own. The night Radama drew his last breath, her supporters moved through the palace like water through cracks. The legitimate heir was dead before dawn. By morning, Ranavalona I stood before the assembled court as the sole queen of Madagascar. The first thing she did was not to celebrate. It was to remove every person who might one day become a reason to regret what she had just done. The royal family of Radama, brothers, cousins, distant relations, were eliminated with the efficiency of someone pulling weeds before a garden can grow. Then she turned to the missionaries. The French and British Christians had been welcomed under Radama. They had schools, churches, influence over the people. Ranavalona saw influence and called it threat. She banned all foreign religious practice. She expelled the missionaries. She declared Christianity punishable by death. And she revived the tangina. The tangina tree's seeds carry a smell of faint almonds. Beautiful, almost sweet, before they kill you. The ordeal was ancient, used once to settle genuine disputes. Under Ranavalona, it became an instrument of governance at scale. You drank the poison. You swallowed 3 pieces of chicken skin. If your body rejected them, if you vomited all 3, you were innocent. If not, your death was taken as your confession. She applied it broadly, arbitrarily, to anyone she found inconvenient. For those who survived the tangina, there was forced labor. Roads carved through dense jungle. Fortresses raised in swampland. No food, no medicine. A French historian present in that era recorded that prisoners feared the sentence of forced labor more than the death penalty itself, because it was the same death stretched across months of suffering. In 1845, a joint Anglo-French fleet attacked the coast. Ranavalona repelled it spectacularly. The victory only deepened her conviction. She sealed the island. Any foreigner who set foot on Madagascar without her permission was executed. She died in 1861 at 83 in her own bed. Her son threw open the borders within weeks. By the end of her 33-year reign, historians estimate Madagascar had lost between 50 and 75% of its population. 2.5 million people at minimum, to war, to famine, to the Tangina, to forced labor on roads that went nowhere anyone needed to go. Madagascar was never colonized while she lived, that is true. While the rest of the continent was being carved between European powers, her island held. The people of Madagascar are still divided over her. One half calls her a national hero. The other looks at the numbers and calls her the destroyer of her own people. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that both of those things are facts. And that history, real history, gives you nowhere comfortable to stand when both are true simultaneously. In Constantinople, a woman of no royal blood was placed at the center of the most powerful empire on earth and decided, one slow decade at a time, that she would never give it back. Not to the church, not to the ministers, not even to her own son. 3. Irene of Athens, the mother who blinded her son in the room where he was born. Byzantium, 797 AD. There is a stone in the world that holds cold the way nothing else does. Porphyry, deep purple red, quarried in the Egyptian desert, cold to the touch in summer and colder still in winter. The emperors of Byzantium lined a specific chamber with it, a room reserved for imperial births, so that the first sensation a child of the purple would feel was the chill of that stone against new skin. They called it the Porphyra, the purple room. In 770, Irene of Athens, a girl of unremarkable background, chosen for reasons no historian has ever fully explained, gave birth to a son in this room. She named him Constantine. 27 years later, she would have his eyes destroyed in that same room, on purpose. Irene had learned power from the inside, slowly, then all at once. When her husband, Emperor Leo IV, died, their son Constantine was 9 years old, and she became regent. She did not simply hold the sea warm, she governed. She convened councils, she negotiated with Rome, she made policy with the sharpness of someone who had been watching carefully for years, and was now finally permitted to act. But Constantine grew up, and when he grew up, he wanted to rule. By 790, the tension had broken open. Constantine rallied the military behind him, expelled his mother from the palace, and ended her regency by force. Irene, who had governed an empire, became a middle-aged woman with nothing. She waited. She maintained her networks. She watched her son govern, and she watched him make mistakes. Military defeat, a controversial divorce, a second marriage the church condemned. His standing collapsed steadily, and her reputation as a stable hand grew ever more appealing to those who wanted change. In 797, Irene acted, a coup, swift and decisive, built from years of patient preparation. Constantine was captured fleeing the city. And here, the story takes a turn that the historical record has preserved in exact, specific detail. Irene ordered her son brought to the Porphyra, to the room where you were being born, to the stone that had been the first thing against his skin. The message was not subtle. What I brought into the world, I have the right to undo. On her orders, Constantine's eyes were removed, the traditional Byzantine method of neutralizing a rival. A blinded man could not reign. because an emperor was required to be physically whole. The wounds were too severe. He did not survive them. Irene emerged from this as sole emperor, not empress, not regent, emperor. She took the masculine title, Basileus, something that had not happened in 500 years of Byzantine history. She nearly married Charlemagne. The merger would have created an empire larger than anything since Rome. Her own ministers overthrew her before it could happen, afraid of being absorbed into the West. She was exiled to the island of Lesbos, the most powerful ruler in the world, reduced to spinning wool to survive. She died there less than a year later. The Eastern Orthodox Church later made her a saint for restoring the veneration of religious icons. The woman who had her son's eyes destroyed in the room where he was born is venerated in Orthodox services to this day. History, as Irene herself could have told you, is not a court of justice. It is a record of who defined the narrative, and sometimes the same life contains both a saint and a monster, and the church preserves only the half it finds convenient. The next woman on this list was 14 years old when she entered a palace. She spent 12 years invisible inside it. She spent the rest of her life ensuring no one would ever overlook her again.
4. Wu Zetian, from invisible attendant to the only female emperor in 4,000 years of Chinese history. 624 to 705 AD.
14 years old. Rank of Kievan. The 5th tier of a 9-tier harem hierarchy. In the court of Emperor Taizong of Tang, Wu Zhao was one of hundreds of beautiful girls selected to serve the emperor. She was given no particular favor. She was given no particular notice. For 12 years, she did not advance a single rank. What those 12 years were for Wu Zhao was an education. She observed who truly held power and who only appeared to. She learned how loyalty was earned and how it was manufactured. She mapped every relationship in that court, every obligation, every hidden resentment. She stored it all, carefully, inside a face that no one paid attention to. When Emperor Taizong died in 649, Wu Zhao was supposed to disappear entirely. Under Tang law, consorts who had borne no children were required to shave their heads and spend their lives in a Buddhist convent. Her story was supposed to end there. Head shaved, robes changed, gone from history. She had other plans. In the final days of the dying emperor's life, she made contact with the crown prince, Li Ji, the man about to become Emperor Gaozong. No one knows exactly what passed between them. What is known is that when Gaozong took the throne, he had Wu Zhao brought back from the convent, secretly, illegally, breaking a law that had never been broken before. She was installed as imperial consort. Then she set about removing the empress. A daughter was born. The daughter died suddenly in her cradle. Wu Zhao accused Empress Wang of having crept in and strangled the child from jealousy. The emperor believed her. Historians have asked, across 15 centuries, whether it was actually Wu Zhao who killed her own newborn daughter to frame the empress. The answer remains unknown, but the logic is cold and clear. The only person who stood to gain from that death, and the only person who had demonstrated sufficient will to carry it out, was Wu Zhao. Empress Wang was deposed. In 655, Wu Zhao became empress. She was 31 years old, and she had, as she would later demonstrate, only just begun. She had Wang and the former consort Xiao sealed in a darkened room. Then she gave the order, 100 strokes of the rod, followed by the removal of their hands and feet. Their remaining bodies were placed in large vats of wine and left to drown. She named this punishment making their bones drunk. After Gaozong died in 683, she placed her own sons on the throne and removed them again when they showed signs of independent thought. One reigned for 55 days before she deposed him because his wife had asked for a favor. The next was removed for having opinions. She built a network of informants, the club, that encouraged the entire population to report on one another. Hundreds of officials, generals, and members of the Tang imperial clan were executed or driven to suicide, most on the basis of anonymous denunciations. No fair trial. In 690, she did something no woman in Chinese history had ever done, and no woman would ever do again. She declared herself emperor. She founded a new dynasty, the Zhou. She was 66 years old. She invented a new Chinese character for her own name, combining the sun and moon, illuminating all under heaven. Because no existing character was large enough for what she had become. Her reign, for all its violence, was not a catastrophe. She reformed the examination system, allowing men of talent regardless of birth to enter government. She managed the empire with genuine competence. Even her harshest critics have conceded this. In 705, dying of illness at 81, she was overthrown by a coup of ministers and her own son restored to the throne. The Zhou dynasty had lasted 15 years. The Tang reclaimed its name. Before she died, she left instructions for her tomb. A great stone stele was to be placed beside it. Not a single word was to be carved on it. It stands there still, unmarked in rain and sun, in all seasons. Blank. Some say she left it wordless so that posterity could judge for itself. Others say it was a silent admission that no language in the world, not even the one she had added a new character to, was sufficient to contain a life like hers. The next woman on this list had no empire, no dynasty, no army of her own, only 4 acts of revenge so perfectly constructed that historians have spent 1,000 years studying the architecture of them. 5. Queen Olga of Kiev. 4 acts of vengeance and the halo of a saint. Kievan Rus, 945 AD. In the autumn of 945, her husband went to collect a tax. He had done it before. It was a routine matter. But this time, having collected, he turned around and demanded to collect again. The Drevlians, the tribe whose territory he had entered, held a council. Their leader delivered the verdict in a single sentence. If a wolf grows accustomed to preying on a flock of sheep, it must be killed. Otherwise, it will take every last one. 2 trees were bent to the ground. One of Igor's legs was bound to each. Then they were released. The news reached Kiev. Olga, alone now, with a young son, received a delegation of 20 Drevlian envoys. They came with an offer. Their prince, Mal, wished to marry her, a polite absorption of the widow and her territory. Olga did not rage. She smiled. She told them this was a most honorable proposal. She asked them to rest in their boats that night, so that the following morning they could be carried into the palace in solemn ceremony, as befitted their importance. The Drevlians were pleased. They went to their boats and slept. That night, on Olga's orders, a large pit was dug directly before the palace gates. In the morning, the Drevlians were carried in, still seated in their litters, still believing themselves to be guests of honor, and thrown, litters and all, into the pit. It was filled with earth. Olga stood at the edge and looked down. "Do you find this honorable?" she asked. That was the first act. She then sent word to Drevlian territory that she had agreed to the proposal, but required a better class of delegation, men of higher standing, worthy of her station. The Drevlians, believing themselves to be winning, sent their finest nobles. Olga welcomed them warmly and announced that she had prepared a bathhouse in the Rus tradition. The envoys, this being a completely customary pre-meeting ritual, suspected nothing. They stepped inside. The doors were locked from outside, then set alight. All 20 men inside burned to death. That was the second act. For the third act, she sent word that she was coming to marry Prince Mal. She asked only to first visit her husband's grave and perform the proper mourning rites. Could they prepare a feast, a reconciliation between old enemies? They could. They did. Olga came. She mourned Igor at his grave, properly, with genuine ceremony. Then she sat at the feast alongside the Drevlians, ate and drank with good cheer, and kept their cups constantly filled. The wine was excellent. None of them suspected it was their last meal. When the signal was given, the soldiers positioned in ambush all around attacked simultaneously. More than 5,000 Drevlians were killed that night. Third act. For the fourth and final act, she besieged the Drevlian capital, Iskorosten, for a full year. The city held. Its walls were solid, its provisions sufficient. So Olga sent in a peace offer. She would pardon everyone inside if they paid a tribute. Not gold. 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from every household. The Drevlians talked it over in bewilderment. The condition was so strange, it seemed almost amusing. What possible value could birds have? But it was certainly easier than continued siege. They agreed. Hundreds of birds were delivered through the city gates. That night, Olga's soldiers tied to the leg of each bird a small piece of cloth soaked in sulfur, set it smoldering, and released them. The birds flew home, to their roosts in the rafters, in the granaries, in the livestock pens inside the walls. Iskorosten caught fire from within. No one escaped in time. The city burned to ash in a single night. Fourth act. What makes these 4 acts remarkable is not only their brutality, it is the patience and architecture behind them. Olga never struck in anger. She struck methodically, in layers, each blow disguised as something else. Ceremony, hospitality, peaceful negotiation. The Drevlians never understood they were walking into a trap until it had already closed. After this, Olga became one of the wisest rulers in the history of Kievan Rus. She reformed taxation. She built infrastructure. She became the first in her dynasty to convert to Christianity, following her visit to Constantinople in 957. The Orthodox Church later canonized her as equal to the apostles. Her name is spoken in every Orthodox service in Russia and Ukraine, still, to this day. The woman who buried envoys alive, burned nobles to death, massacred 5,000 at a feast, and incinerated an entire city with birds. A saint. History, as I said, does not judge in the ways we expect it to. In China, 3 centuries later, a 16-year-old girl would enter the imperial court the way smoke enters a room, quietly, everywhere at once, and impossible to remove once it had settled in. 6. Empress Dowager Cixi, the woman who governed China for 47 years. From behind a curtain, 1835 to 1908. She arrived in the court of Emperor Jia Nanfeng as noble Lady Lan, 16 years old. Her father was a mid-ranking official Now dead, she brought with her a striking face and a mind that never stopped observing. She studied how to approach the emperor. She learned to speak with him about affairs of state when he was tired, exhausted by the demands of an empire under relentless external pressure. She used her rare talent for calligraphy to help him draft imperial edicts. She made herself useful, essential. In 1856, she gave him the one thing no other woman in the harem had managed to give him: a son. The child was not a comfort to Cixi. He was a key. She understood that completely. In 1861, Jia Nanfeng died at 30, in flight from Beijing as Anglo-French forces attacked. The child, now the Tongxi Emperor, 5 years old, ascended the throne. 8 senior ministers were named as regents. Cixi was not among them. She was 26 years old. She had less than a week to act before those 8 ministers consolidated power. She made contact with Prince Gong, the dead emperor's respected younger brother. While the funeral procession was still en route to Beijing, they planned in silence across days of formal mourning. When the coffin reached the city, the coup came that night. All 8 regent ministers were arrested, 2 executed immediately. The remaining 6 stripped of rank and sent home. Cixi and the principal empress, Zetian, became co-regents. Everyone in the court understood who actually held power between the two. The coup had taken less than 24 hours, conducted in the midst of a newly dead emperor's funeral rites. From 1861 to 1908, Cixi governed China, not once, but 3 times, across 3 emperors, each placed on the throne young enough to need a guardian, and removed or managed whenever they showed signs of independence. Her son, the Tongxi Emperor, died at 19, officially of smallpox. Certain less official sources suggest other possibilities. No charge was ever brought. In 1881, her co-regent Xian, the only counterweight to Cixi's absolute dominance, died suddenly after breakfast. She had been in perfectly good health the previous day. No charge was ever brought. Her nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, was the only one who dared to genuinely challenge her. In 1898, he launched the 100 Days Reform, sweeping modernization, modeled on Japan, opening China to a future it desperately needed. For 103 days, edicts poured out of the palace: a new examination system, modern schools, a reformed military, free commerce. It was the first real chance China had had to change course in decades. Cixi watched each edict with eyes cold as stone, not because she failed to understand its importance, but because she understood, better than anyone, that every step transferred power to people she could not control. After 103 days, she acted. Guangxu was arrested and confined to a small palace on an island within the Forbidden City. For 10 years, he was permitted no contact with anyone outside Cixi's circle. She told the court he was ill. Everyone knew it was not the truth. No one said so aloud. In the autumn of 1908, Cixi herself fell gravely ill, and in his small palace on the island of Yingtai, the Guangxu Emperor was also ill. On November 14, 1908, the Guangxu Emperor died. He was 37 years old. Cixi died the following day. November 15th, 24 hours apart. In 2008, scientists testing samples of Guangxu's hair and fingernails found arsenic levels 2,000 times above the normal threshold, sufficient to cause death. No direct evidence pointed to who gave the order. The numbers alone remain. On the afternoon of November 14th, hours after Guangshu's death, knowing she herself would die the following morning. Cixi was still lucid enough to receive senior ministers and issue her final testament. She named Puyi, Guangshu's 3-year-old great-nephew, as heir. A child again, a child who would need a guardian. Even as death closed in, the reflex for control had not stopped. Among her last recorded words, Cixi said, "Women should not hold political power. This is something I regret not having followed." The woman who governed China for 47 years looked back on her life and said she wished she hadn't done it. No one who heard it knew whether to laugh or weep, possibly both. 1,000 years before Cixi, in the court of the Western Jin dynasty, an empress required no patience and no curtain. She operated in full daylight while her husband still lived. She was the only one on this list who committed murder with her own hands. 7. Jia Nanfeng, the empress who killed with her own hands. Western Jin dynasty, 290 to 300 AD. When Emperor Wu of Jin chose a wife for his heir, he faced what appeared to be a simple choice. On one side, Wei Guangqi, gentle, virtuous, well-educated, beautiful. On the other, Jia Nanfeng, daughter of a deceased prime minister, owed a debt of gratitude. Short, dark-complexioned, buck-toothed, described in their historical records with a specificity that tells you the writers were frightened of her, even in retrospect. The emperor chose Wei Guangqi. The Empress Dowager intervened and insisted on Jia Nanfeng to repay the debt to the Jia family. That decision, one conversation, one act of maternal insistence, would eventually help bring down the Western Jin dynasty entirely. From her very first days as crown princess, Jia Nanfeng made clear she had no use for the conventions of the women's quarters. She wielded something no one dared confront, a ferocity bordering on unreason, and a readiness to use violence that required no justification. In 290, Emperor Wu died. Her husband, Sima Zhong, became Emperor Hui of Jin. History has preserved one of his utterances upon being told that famine had spread across the land and the people had no rice. If they have no rice, why don't they eat meat? With a husband like that, Jia Nanfeng had nothing to fear and no one to hide from. She was the first woman on this list who did not wait for her husband to die before acting. She acted while he lived, openly in front of the entire court, and no one made a sound. On one occasion, Emperor Hui admired the delicate hands of a court lady attending him. Word reached Jia Nanfeng. A few days later, she had a sealed box delivered to him with word that something was inside he would greatly enjoy. Inside were the severed hands of that court lady, still fresh. The emperor reeled and did not dare speak of another woman again. Jia Nanfeng bore 4 daughters in succession, not a single son. In a court where an empress without a male heir was always one birth away from being superseded, this was the source of her consuming dread. Any consort who fell pregnant became a direct threat to everything she had. She did not send others to handle it. She went herself. The Jin dynastic records preserve one specific event in detail that brings even readers 1,000 years later to a halt. Upon learning that an imperial consort was pregnant, Jia Nanfeng rose from where she sat, went directly to the woman's quarters, took a halberd from the guard standing nearby, and drove it into the pregnant woman's abdomen in a single thrust. Both mother and child died on the spot. She returned the halberd to the guard and walked away. Unable to produce a son, she brought in a nephew in secret, raised him in the palace, and constructed a story that he was her own child, had him installed as crown prince. It was her most audacious move and her final mistake. The moment she touched the succession, the point that affected every great clan at court, the coalition against her began to form. In 300, one of the Jin royal princes launched a coup. Soldiers entered the palace at night. Jia Nanfeng was arrested without resistance. Not even her husband stepped forward. She was taken to a small room and compelled to drink wine laced with poison. She died that same day. Her fall ignited the War of the Eight Princes, 16 years of civil war that tore the empire open and paved the way for the northern invasions that destroyed the Western Jin decades later. The violence of one woman in one palace did not merely destroy the lives she directly touched. It helped collapse an entire dynasty. She had never intended to leave any legacy. She had only ever intended to survive. From China now, to a girl from Florence who arrived in France at 14 in complete isolation. No family, no alliances, no love from her husband. She would spend 30 years learning how to survive in a country that never fully accepted her, and then she would burn the night with bells. 8. Catherine de Medici. The night the bells rang. France, 1519 to 1589. She arrived in France at 14, carrying two things the French court found equally offensive: an Italian surname and a merchant family's blood. They called her the merchant's daughter, behind her back, always, but loud enough. Her husband, Prince Henri, didn't love her. He did not pretend to. He spent 30 years in open devotion to his mistress, a widow, 20 years his senior, and no one in the court found it worth hiding from the Queen. For the first 10 years, Catherine bore no children at all. In a court where a queen's sole purpose was to produce an heir, 10 years of barrenness was the slow execution of her position. People spoke openly of deposing her. Only King Francis, her father-in-law, who held a certain affection for his Italian daughter-in-law, kept her in place. Then, in 1544, she gave birth to her first child, then another, then another. 10 children in 12 years. 8 survived to adulthood. 3 would become kings of France. She had cleared the first hurdle. The real test came in 1559, when Henri II died from a jousting accident, a lance splinter through his visor and into his brain. Catherine became a widow at 40. She chose black as her mourning color for the rest of her life. Not out of grief, her mourning for a man who had never loved her was its own complicated thing, but because the black of a noble widow was the finest armor she could wear in a court full of wolves. Among the people Catherine brought with her from Florence was a perfumer, René the Florentine. He set up on the Pont au Change and became, within years, the most whispered about man in Paris. The court called him her poisoner. His gloves were said to carry something slow and untraceable. At least 2 deaths near Catherine were attributed to those gloves. Nothing was ever proven. The smell of civet and orris root, Catherine's preferred perfume, became, in the French court, a smell that made people uneasy. A beautiful smell that the body had learned to distrust. France in the 16th century was tearing itself apart between Catholic and Protestant. Catherine, a Catholic by faith, but above all a pragmatist, had spent years trying to balance the two sides. In 1572, she attempted to seal the peace through marriage, her daughter Marguerite to the Huguenot leader, Henry of Navarre. The wedding brought thousands of Huguenot nobles into Paris. The two factions in one city together. 4 days before the wedding, an assassination attempt wounded Admiral de Coligny, the supreme Huguenot military commander and the king's most trusted advisor. No one claimed responsibility. Fingers pointed to the House of Guise. Coligny was alive and the king was furious. Catherine found herself pinned between forces that were about to explode with or without her. On the night of the 23rd of August, Catherine went to Charles IX. No historical record survived of what was said in that room. By morning, the king had signed the order. In the early hours of the feast day of Saint Bartholomew, the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois rang out in the darkness. The marks that had been carefully painted on the doors of Huguenot homes in the preceding days became targets. Coligny was killed that night, his body thrown into the street below his window. The killing spread through Paris and then into the provinces, continuing for weeks. Huguenots were killed in churches, in streets, in cellars. Men, women, children. For more than 400 years, historians have debated Catherine's true role. Did she order the whole massacre, or only the targeted removal of Coligny, after which the Catholic mobs took over and the rest ran on its own momentum? She never admitted anything. She went to her grave with whatever she knew. What is certain, she was in that room on the night of the 23rd. She spoke to her son. By morning, tens of thousands of people were dead. Catherine outlived 3 of her sons on the throne and watched each one die without leaving an heir. The House of Valois ended with her. She died in 1589 at 69, and Paris held almost no funeral rites. The city was under siege. The court had other concerns. The woman who wielded power over France for 30 years was lowered into the earth in near silence. Her contemporaries called her the Florentine Serpent, the Black Witch, the Mother of Murderers. Modern historians are more conflicted. She held France together through 30 years of religious civil war, preserving the throne for a dynasty that repaid her with nothing. But St. Bartholomew's Day does not disappear behind that argument. Tens of thousands of dead cannot be entirely explained by the pressures of circumstance. This is what makes her the most troubling figure on this list. Not because she is simply monstrous, but because the line between political survival and crime in her life is so thin that you can stand upon it for years without knowing which side you are on. From France, now, to a cold stone castle in Hungary, to a woman whose crimes operated for 25 years in open view of the surrounding villages, the local clergy, and the crown, and still no one moved to stop her, because the victims were poor. 9. Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess. Choctich Castle, 1575 to 1610. The castle smelled of iron and frost. That is what a witness at the trial described. Iron from the blood, and the cold of stone walls at an altitude where winter temperatures fell below 15 degrees below zero. The cold that preserved everything longer than it should have been preserved. That, several forensic historians have noted grimly, may have been part of why the worst sessions happened in winter. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into a Hungarian noble family that ranked among the most powerful in Central Europe. Kings and military commanders across generations. A name attached to real power. The Bathory family was also known for something else: strange tendencies that appeared again and again in the bloodline. Her uncle was recorded as a practitioner of black magic. Her brother was notorious for fits of uncontrollable rage. Elizabeth herself had suffered mysterious seizures since childhood that the physicians of her day could not explain. In 1575, at 15, she married Ferenc Nadasti, a celebrated military commander, one of the finest Hungary had produced in the wars against the Ottomans. On the surface, an ordinary aristocratic marriage, 5 children, a well-matched union. Ferenc was frequently away at war, leaving Elizabeth alone in Cixi castle, with hundreds of servant girls entirely dependent on her. It was during those years that something inside her began to fracture in a direction no one could have anticipated. There was no single moment that marked the beginning, no specific event. It was a slow escalation from the punishments the nobility of that era considered ordinary treatment of servants, to punishments growing heavier until the threshold from which there is no return was crossed without anyone noticing precisely when. Servant girls began to disappear. At first, there were still explanations. This one had run away. That one had gone home. Another had died of illness. But the numbers grew and the explanations grew less convincing. The surrounding villages began to dread their daughters being recruited for service in the castle. Ferenc Nadasti knew something was happening. He did not stop it. He died in 1604, leaving Elizabeth entirely unsupervised on her own lands. No husband, no one to answer to. Only absolute authority over the castle and the girls within it. The 6 years that followed were the most unrestrained of her life. She did not act alone. She had 4 regular accomplices: an older woman, a servant, a dwarf, and an older woman believed to have been the greatest influence over her, who died before the crimes were exposed. Girls were brought to the castle through various means. Daughters of poor peasants first, families with no power, and no one to appeal to. When she had exhausted the supply from the lower classes, Elizabeth opened a school in etiquette and courtly manners for young women, promising to teach them how to conduct themselves in high society. Families of minor nobility sent their daughters gladly. None came back. What was documented in witness testimony at the trial was so specific that readers find it difficult to get through in a single sitting. What is certain is that enough happened. Enough that the 4 people closest to her were executed after confessing. Enough that even those who might have wished to protect her found themselves unable to do so openly. Here is what stopped it finally. She ran out of poor girls and started taking daughters of minor nobility. Suddenly, there were people with power and voice losing their children. And suddenly, King Matthias II of Hungary, who happened to owe the Bathory family an enormous sum of money, realized that if Elizabeth were convicted and her assets seized, that debt would vanish. In December 1610, Count Thurzo broke into Cixi castle at night. He found one girl already dead in the main hall, another dying, many more locked in the cellar. Elizabeth Bathory was not put on trial. Her noble status protected her from being judged as a common criminal. Her 4 accomplices were tried in her place and executed. She was sealed inside a room in her own castle. Workers bricked up the door. A small slot was left for food, another for a sliver of light. In that room, Elizabeth Bathory lived for 4 more years. No visitors, no conversation, no sky, In 1614, a guard discovered she had died, face down on the floor, with no obvious signs of violence or illness. She was 64. It is said that in her final days, she repeatedly asked for pen and paper. They were never given to her. Whatever she wished to write, she took with her to the grave. Some modern researchers argue she was wrongfully accused, that King Matthias had a financial motive, that witnesses were coerced, that the case was constructed rather than discovered. There was no public trial. She was never directly confronted with the accusations. These questions have never been fully resolved, whether 80 victims or 650, whether the blood bathing was real or legend. The iron and frost of that castle are certain. The bricked-up door is certain. The slot for food and the absence of pen and paper are certain. What she put into that room, and what that room eventually took from her, is the part that has followed her name across 4 centuries. And finally, a woman who never sought revenge against any specific person. A woman whose enemy was not a face, but an idea. And because you cannot truly burn an idea, she burned everything else instead. One name, one sentence, one stake at a time. 10. Mary I of England, Bloody Mary. England, 1516 to 1558. Before she was Bloody Mary, she was just Mary. She was adored. The only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Intelligent, devout, educated in Latin, French, Spanish, theology, music. A princess her father showed off to visiting dignitaries, the treasure of the English court. She was 17 years old when all of it ended. Henry VIII wanted a male heir. Catherine could not give him one. He wanted Anne Boleyn. The Pope refused to grant a divorce. So Henry declared himself head of the Church of England, granted his own divorce, and expelled Catherine. Mary was stripped of her title as princess, declared illegitimate, separated entirely from her mother and forbidden to see her, forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to the infant Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child of the woman who had taken her mother's place. Her father pressed her to sign a document acknowledging that her parents' marriage had been unlawful and that she was not his legitimate child. She refused for years. With each refusal, the conditions of her life grew worse. Catherine of Aragon died in 1536, alone, in a cold and damp castle. Mary was not permitted to go and say goodbye. That wound never healed, not for the rest of her life. From 17 to 37, 20 years, Mary lived through her father's 6 marriages, 2 of them ending in beheadings. She watched Anne Boleyn, the woman she despised, executed by that same father on charges of adultery. She watched 2 more queens beheaded. She watched England systematically dismantled from the faith her mother had given her. Protestant reforms under her father. Deeper Protestantism under her half-brother Edward VI. Catholic churches demolished, the Mass forbidden, priests expelled. The Catholic faith became the only thing Mary had that had never changed, never betrayed her, never wavered under the pressure of politics or desire. When Edward VI died in 1553 at 15, the Protestant advisors around him altered the line of succession to prevent Catholic Mary from inheriting. Lady Jane Grey was queen for 9 days before the country simply refused to accept it. Mary was the legitimate daughter of Henry VIII. When she appeared in Norfolk calling for support, Tens of thousands rallied. The troops sent to stop her deserted. She rode into London to crowds who cheered. England loved her that day. No one thought about what came next. Mary I's agenda required no concealment. Return England to the Catholic faith. She repealed all Protestant reforms. She restored papal authority. She reinstated the heresy laws. From 1555 to 1558, in barely 4 years, more than 300 Protestants were burned alive at stakes across England. The first was John Rogers, a priest who had helped translate the Bible into English. His wife and 9 children stood watching as he was set alight. At Oxford, 2 elderly bishops, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, were burned together. As the flames began, Latimer turned to Ridley and said, "We shall this day light such a candle in England as I trust shall never be put out." Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the man who had helped Henry VIII divorce Mary's mother, had signed a recantation under pressure. At the very moment before his burning, he withdrew it. He thrust his right hand, the hand that had signed the paper, into the flame first and held it there until it burned before the fire reached the rest of him. Not all 300 were major religious figures. The majority were ordinary people, weavers, farmers, blacksmiths, housewives, whose only distinction was refusing to recant their Protestant faith. Mary did not spare them for their ordinariness. Alongside all of this, Mary carried another pain she could never conceal. She was 37 when she took the throne. She wanted children desperately. She married Philip II of Spain, 11 years younger, already one of the most powerful men in Europe, who came to England, performed his duty, and left. Twice Mary believed herself pregnant. Twice her abdomen swelled in exactly the manner of pregnancy. Twice the entire court prepared to welcome an heir. Twice no child was born. Modern physicians suggest she may have been suffering from uterine or ovarian cancer, what was then called phantom pregnancy. No one in her time understood what they were seeing. They watched as after each shattered hope, Mary grew sicker, older, and bitterer. Philip never returned after his second visit. She wrote letters imploring him to come. Those letters survive to this day. Whatever you feel about what she did, you cannot read them without feeling sorrow for the woman who wrote them. Mary died in November 1558 at 42. Her sister Elizabeth succeeded immediately and returned England to Protestantism. Everything Mary had done in 5 years was undone within months. The Protestants she had burned became martyrs. The name Bloody Mary was given to her by John Fox's Book of Martyrs, published 5 years after her death. It shaped the Protestant memory of her permanently. And Protestant England was the England that wrote history for the next 3 centuries. Her father had executed more than 70,000 people across his reign. Her brother also burned Catholics. Her sister Elizabeth would later execute hundreds of Catholics by various means. Only Mary carries the name Bloody to this day. History is not a court of justice. It is a record of who won. Before she died, Mary told the attendants at her bedside that she had seen small children in her dreams, children playing, smiling at her. Whether those were the children she never had, or the children of the people she had burned, or something else entirely. No one knows. No one thought to ask. She said nothing more. 10 women, 10 different centuries, 10 different kingdoms and faiths and languages and thrones, and one thing in common. Each of them arrived at a moment some through cruelty, some through circumstance, some through choices no one could have anticipated, where absolute power had fused with absolute pain, where survival and brutality had become indistinguishable from one another, where the line between what was justified and what was not had been crossed so quietly that no one, including them, knew exactly when it happened. History does not ask whether they should be judged. It records what was done and leaves every subsequent generation to sit with the same question. If I were in that position, with that power, with that pain, what would I have done? That question has no comfortable answer, but it is the only honest reason any of us keep coming back to history. Because the honest answer, if you sit with it long enough, is not as certain as we would like it to be.